The road to war. The fall of the Roman Republic. In 48 BC, the Roman Republic stood on the brink of destruction. What had once been a mighty political system, built on centuries of tradition, was now tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war between two of Rome's greatest generals, Gaius Julius Caesar, a military genius and populist leader, loved by his soldiers and feared by the Senate, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey the Great, once the most powerful man in Rome, now leading the forces of the Senate against his former ally. The Battle of Pharsalus would not just decide who ruled Rome, but whether the Republic itself would survive. 1. The rise of Caesar and the First Triumvirate. To understand how Rome descended into civil war, we must go back nearly a decade earlier, to 60 BC, when three of the most powerful men in Rome formed a secret alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Julius Caesar, a rising political star, eager to expand his influence. Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, known for his victories in the East. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, seeking military glory. This alliance was built on convenience rather than trust. Pompey wanted land for his veterans. Crassus wanted military commands. Caesar wanted political power and military campaigns. Together, they dominated Roman politics for years. But alliances in Rome never lasted forever. The breaking of the Triumvirate. By 53 BC, everything had changed. Crassus was killed in his disastrous campaign against the Parthians, leaving a power vacuum. Pompey and Caesar grew increasingly suspicious of each other. In 54 BC, Caesar's daughter Julia, who had been married to Pompey to secure their alliance, died in childbirth, severing their last personal connection. With Crassus gone and Julia dead, the triumvirate collapsed, leaving only two men, Caesar and Pompey, vying for absolute power. 2. The March on Rome. Crossing the Rubicon. By 50 BC, the Roman Senate, led by Pompey and his aristocratic allies, viewed Caesar as a threat to the Republic. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar was left with a fateful choice: obey the Senate and risk arrest, exile, or even death, defy them and march on Rome with his army. On January 10, 49 BC, Caesar made his decision. He crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary separating his province from Italy, declaring, "Alia acta est," the die is cast. With one act of defiance, he had declared war on Rome itself. Pompey and the Senate, caught off guard, fled the city without a fight, retreating to Greece to raise an army. Caesar entered Rome as a conqueror, but he knew the war was just beginning. 3. The early campaigns. Caesar versus Pompey. With Rome under his control, Caesar turned his attention to Pompey. Pompey had the Senate's backing, a larger army, and naval superiority, but Caesar had speed, discipline, and the unwavering loyalty of his troops. Over the next 2 years, they fought a series of campaigns across Italy, Spain, and Greece, each maneuvering to outwit the other. The Battle of Dyrrhachium, Caesar's near defeat. In 48 BC, Caesar finally caught up with Pompey in Greece, near Dyrrhachium. But this time, Pompey was ready. Using superior numbers and supply lines, Pompey inflicted one of Caesar's worst defeats. Caesar's forces were forced to retreat, suffering heavy losses. For the first time, it seemed that Pompey might win the war. But Caesar was not done yet. Instead of retreating back to Italy, he regrouped and marched inland, into Thessaly, luring Pompey into a final confrontation. This decision would lead them to Pharsalus, the battle that would decide the fate of Rome. 4. The armies gather, preparing for Pharsalus. By August 48 BC, both armies had set up camp near Pharsalus, in central Greece. Pompey's army, the Senate's last hope, 47,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry outnumbering Caesar nearly to 2-1. Many of his troops were fresh recruits with little battlefield experience, supported by Eastern allies and auxiliary forces, but lacking cohesion. Pompey's strategy was simple: use his cavalry advantage to outflank Caesar and crush him. Caesar's army, the veteran legions, 21,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, composed of elite, battle-hardened soldiers. Many of his men had fought with him for over a decade, smaller in number, but superior in discipline and experience. Caesar knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew Pompey's weakness: overconfidence. Every day, Caesar marched his army to the base of Pompey's hill, challenging him to fight. Every day, Pompey refused, waiting for Caesar to run out of supplies. But then, Pompey made a mistake. His officers, eager for glory and rewards, pressured him to stop delaying and attack. On August 9, 48 BC, Pompey finally moved his army onto the plains, abandoning his defensive position. The battle was set. By the next day, the future of Rome would be decided. The road to Pharsalus, strategy, deception, and desperation. As the Roman civil war raged on, the battle lines between Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus were drawn ever tighter. The aftermath of the Battle of Dyrrhachium had left Caesar in a precarious position, his forces battered and his supplies dwindling. But if history had proven anything, it was that Caesar thrived under pressure. Pompey, on the other hand, had the upper hand. His army outnumbered Caesar's nearly to 2-1, and he had significant support from the Roman Senate and Eastern allies. But numerical superiority does not always equate to victory, and the events leading up to the decisive clash at Pharsalus would be a testament to that. 1. Pompey's reluctance and the Fabian strategy. Pompey was no fool, a veteran general who had fought and won numerous campaigns across the Mediterranean. He understood that Caesar's strength lay in his battle-hardened legions. While Pompey had the numbers, much of his force was composed of newly raised recruits and Eastern auxiliaries who lacked the discipline of Caesar's men. Thus, rather than engaging in a pitched battle, Pompey opted for a defensive strategy, one reminiscent of Fabius Maximus, the Roman general who had used delaying tactics to wear down Hannibal during the Second Punic War. By keeping his forces stationed in strong defensive positions, Pompey aimed to starve Caesar's forces of resources, forcing him into a desperate situation. This approach infuriated many of Pompey's officers, who were eager for a decisive battle. Men like Scipio, Afranius, and Ahenobarbus accused him of cowardice, demanding that he take the fight to Caesar rather than wait. But Pompey remained steadfast, for now. 2. Caesar's tactical genius. A man who couldn't be cornered. Caesar, ever the master tactician, recognized the danger of being pinned down. His army was smaller, but his men were veterans who had fought with him for years. Unlike Pompey's forces, they were battle-tested in the harsh campaigns of Gaul, where discipline and adaptability were the keys to survival. Caesar needed a way to regain the strategic advantage, and he found one in speed and deception. The race to Thessaly began. Caesar knew that to win, he needed reinforcements. His key objective was to link up with his scattered forces under Domitius Calvinus, and to do that, he had to move fast. His march was relentless, covering vast distances in a short period of time. But Pompey had anticipated this, and the two great commanders found themselves locked in a race across Greece, each trying to reach their allies before the other. At one point, Caesar's luck seemed to run out. His scouts were struggling to relay messages, and many of his Gallic cavalry had defected to Pompey's side. But in a surprising turn of fate, some of these defectors changed their minds once again and raced to warn Domitius Calvinus of Pompey's approach. Armed with this information, Domitius was able to reposition his forces and merge with Caesar's army, giving him a crucial boost in strength. This moment was a turning point. Though still outnumbered, Caesar's forces were now unified, and with his legendary ability to inspire unshakable loyalty in his troops, his army was ready to face Pompey. 3. The psychological warfare. Confidence versus complacency. The two armies finally came face to face in Thessaly, near the city of Pharsalus. Pompey, still preferring to avoid direct conflict, took up a strong defensive position on high ground, forcing Caesar to either attack uphill or attempt to outmaneuver him. But here, a fatal flaw began to emerge in Pompey's camp. Overconfidence. Pompey's officers, many of whom were seasoned politicians rather than warriors, were already dividing up the spoils of war before the battle had even begun. They discussed who would take Caesar's estates, who would assume his political titles, and who would control Rome after the inevitable victory. This kind of thinking was dangerous, as it blinded them to the true threat Caesar posed. Caesar, on the other hand, maintained his composure. He studied the terrain, analyzed Pompey's weaknesses, and formulated a strategy that would turn the battle in his favor. His men, despite being outnumbered, remained fiercely loyal. They trusted in their commander and were willing to fight to the last man. 4. Caesar's counterplan. Flipping the script. Seeing that Pompey refused to attack, Caesar took matters into his own hands. Each day, he marched his army out of camp, drawing up his forces in battle formation at the base of Pompey's hill, challenging him to a fight. But each time, Pompey refused to take the bait. Realizing that he could not force Pompey into battle directly, Caesar decided to play the long game. He knew that if he kept his army on the move, continuously shifting positions, he could wear down Pompey's forces, which were not as well trained for long campaigns. This tactic put immense psychological pressure on Pompey's officers, who were already growing restless. Seeing Caesar constantly maneuvering made them fear that he might slip away and prolong the war even further. The impatience among Pompey's ranks reached a boiling point, and then Pompey made the mistake Caesar had been waiting for. 5. Pompey's fatal decision. The battle is set. On August 9, 48 BC, just as Caesar was about to put his next move into action, Pompey finally gave in to the demands of his officers and moved his army onto the plains. Abandoning his defensive high ground, historians debate why Pompey made this decision. Some believe he truly feared that Caesar was about to escape and decided to strike while he had the numbers advantage. Others argue that he simply could no longer withstand the pressure from his officers. Either way, the moment he left the safety of his high ground, Caesar knew he had him. Pompey's army deployed into its battle formation. Nearly 47,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, dwarfing Caesar's 21,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. While Pompey's men were numerous, they lacked the cohesion and experience of Caesar's legions. Caesar, ever confident, did not waver. He saw the flaws in Pompey's formation, and he was ready to exploit them. As the sun set over the battlefield, both armies prepared for what would be one of the most decisive engagements in Roman history. The next day, the fate of Rome would be decided. The clash of titans, the Battle of Pharsalus. As the morning sun rose over the fields of Pharsalus, two of the greatest military minds of their time stood face to face. The armies of Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus were finally ready for battle. Despite being outnumbered nearly to 2-1, Caesar was confident. His men were veterans, hardened by years of warfare. Pompey, on the other hand, had a numerical advantage, but many of his troops were inexperienced. What unfolded on August 9, 48 BC would become one of the most famous battles in Roman history, a battle that would decide the fate of the Republic. 1. The battlefields and army formations. The plain of Pharsalus provided an open field for battle, but Pompey had initially occupied the high ground, an advantageous defensive position. However, under pressure from his officers, he moved his army down onto the open plains, giving up his strongest strategic advantage. Pompey's formation numerical superiority: 47,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and thousands of archers and slingers, arranged in 3 lines, with his strongest legions at the front. His left wing was the key to his strategy, with Labienus leading the cavalry, Pompey's greatest strength. His plan: use his overwhelming cavalry to crush Caesar's right flank, then encircle and annihilate his army. Caesar's formation strategic mastery: 21,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, some sources suggest closer to 30,000 infantry, also arranged in 3 lines, but his troops were more disciplined and battle-hardened. His right flank, opposite Pompey's cavalry, was the most vulnerable, but Caesar had a hidden counterplan. 2. The opening moves: a feint and a trap. As battle commenced, Caesar's legions marched forward, but they noticed something unusual. Pompey's infantry did not advance to meet them. This was not the typical Roman way of fighting. Normally, both armies would charge and clash in the center, but Pompey ordered his men to hold their ground. Why? Pompey believed that Caesar's men would tire themselves out charging across the battlefield. He wanted to use their exhaustion against them before engaging in close combat, but Caesar's troops were too disciplined to fall for it. Halfway through the charge, Caesar's legion suddenly stopped. They paused, caught their breath, and then resumed their advance, a move that completely neutralized Pompey's plan. Meanwhile, on the left flank, Pompey launched his main attack, his cavalry charge. 3. The turning point: the collapse of Pompey's cavalry. Pompey's cavalry advantage was overwhelming: 7,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry force in the war, against Caesar's 1,000 cavalry, led by Titus Labienus, a former officer of Caesar who had defected to Pompey's side. Pompey's strategy relied on Labienus' cavalry smashing through Caesar's right flank, then flanking around to hit Caesar's rear, trapping his army. At first, Caesar's cavalry struggled under the assault. They were pushed back, just as Pompey had planned. But Caesar was one step ahead. Anticipating this, Caesar had hidden a 4th line of troops, minus 3,000 of his most elite infantry, directly behind his cavalry. These men were armed with javelins and spears, specifically trained to counter cavalry attacks. As Pompey's cavalry rushed in for the kill, Caesar's fourth line suddenly emerged and launched their spears directly into the charging horsemen. The effect was devastating. Pompey's cavalry panicked. They had never trained to fight against a hidden infantry ambush. The 7,000 horsemen collapsed in chaos, retreating not just from Caesar's right flank, but the entire battlefield. And then, Caesar gave the order to counterattack. 4. The final blow. Caesar breaks Pompey's lines. With Pompey's cavalry gone, his left flank was completely exposed. Caesar immediately took advantage. His hidden fourth line wheeled around and attacked Pompey's left flank. At the same time, Caesar's 10th Legion, his personal favorite, composed of his best warriors, launched a brutal frontal assault. Pompey's soldiers were trapped, attacked from both the front and the side. Seeing his left flank collapsing, Pompey panicked. He still had a chance to turn the battle around. His center and right flank were holding. But then, Caesar played his final card. He ordered his fresh third line of reserves to charge forward. Unlike Pompey's men, who were exhausted from standing and fighting for hours, Caesar's third line was rested. They pushed into the heart of Pompey's formation, driving his men back. The entire Pompeian army began to crumble. And then, the moment that sealed the battle, Pompey fled. 5. The collapse and mass surrender. The sight of their commander abandoning the battlefield was too much for Pompey's men. Many of them immediately threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others attempted to flee, but were cut down by Caesar's pursuing forces. By the end of the day, 15,000 Pompeian soldiers lay dead. 24,000 surrendered. Caesar's losses? Only 1,200 men. Pompey's once mighty army was destroyed. The war was not yet over, but the road to victory was now clear for Caesar. As his troops cheered in celebration, Caesar stood quietly, watching the battlefield. He knew what came next. Pompey was on the run, and Caesar would not stop until he was found. The aftermath of Pharsalus, the fall of Pompey and the rise of Caesar. The Battle of Pharsalus had ended in a shocking yet decisive victory for Gaius Julius Caesar. Despite being outnumbered nearly to 2-1, Caesar had outmaneuvered, outclassed, and ultimately crushed the once invincible legions of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The fate of Rome was forever altered on that battlefield in Thessaly, but the war was far from over. This is the story of what happened next, a tale of betrayal, exile, and the beginning of Caesar's path to absolute power. 1. Pompey's escape. A desperate flight. As Pompey watched his legions collapse under the weight of Caesar's counterattack, he realized there was no hope of salvaging the battle. What had begun as a confrontation, where he held the numerical and strategic advantage, had turned into a full-scale rout. His trusted officers had either fallen or fled, his cavalry had disintegrated, and his once mighty legions were either dead or surrendering en masse. Seeing that his own personal safety was now at risk, Pompey had no choice but to flee. Accompanied by a small contingent of bodyguards, he made his way out of the battlefield, abandoning his men to their fate. His destination? The coastal city of Larissa, where he hoped to regroup and escape by sea. By the time Caesar's troops stormed his camp, Pompey was already gone. But where could he go? Rome was lost to him. The Senate had placed all its faith in him, and his humiliating defeat at Pharsalus meant that his allies would begin to abandon him. The entire political balance of the Roman world had shifted in a single day. Pompey had two options: flee to North Africa, where his allies, like Cato the Younger and Scipio, still held strongholds in Utica and Numidia; seek refuge in the east, where he had once ruled with immense power and had deep connections with the kings of Egypt and Asia Minor. With little time to weigh his options, he chose Egypt. 2. The betrayal in Egypt. The death of Pompey. Pompey's reasoning for heading to Egypt was simple. The young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, owed his throne to Pompey's previous support for his father, Ptolemy XII. Many of Pompey's former officers and soldiers had fought in the Egyptian campaigns and still served in the Egyptian military. Egypt was wealthy, powerful, and outside of Caesar's immediate grasp. But Pompey failed to consider one thing: Egypt was not the same as before. Upon arriving off the coast of Alexandria, Pompey sent word to the young pharaoh, requesting asylum and military aid. The response was not immediate, and the general waited on his ship, surrounded by his wife Cornelia and a handful of loyal followers. Eventually, a small Egyptian boat arrived to take Pompey ashore. But something felt wrong. There was no grand welcome, no show of support. Among those in the boat was Lucius Septimius, a former officer of Pompey. Cornelia, watching from the ship, fell to deep unease. As Pompey stepped into the boat, he attempted to break the tension by speaking to Septimius. "Surely, an old comrade will not turn his back on me." But Septimius said nothing. As they rowed toward the shore, Pompey finally realized the truth. He had been betrayed. Before he could react, Septimius and the Egyptian guards drew their swords and stabbed him. Pompey collapsed in the boat, bleeding out in silence. His once mighty life reduced to a quiet, lonely death in the middle of the sea. His body was thrown overboard, and his severed head was sent to Pharaoh Ptolemy as a gift for Caesar. 3. Caesar arrives in Egypt, a hollow victory. By the time Caesar reached Egypt, pursuing his old rival, he was greeted with a horrifying sight. Pompey's head presented to him as a trophy. But rather than celebrating, Caesar recoiled in disgust. This was not how he had wanted the conflict to end. Despite their rivalry, Pompey had been a great Roman, a former ally, and a worthy adversary. He had once been married to Caesar's own daughter, Julia, and they had ruled Rome together during the first triumvirate. To see him betrayed, executed, and discarded like a common criminal was not a moment of triumph. It was a reminder of how treacherous and cruel power struggles could be. Caesar publicly condemned Ptolemy XIII for his actions, though in reality, he likely saw this as an opportunity. With Pompey dead, the war was not yet over, but his greatest rival was gone. 4. The aftermath. The road to dictatorship. With Pompey's death, one chapter of Rome's history closed, but another, far darker one, was about to begin. Pompey's remaining supporters, including Cato, Scipio, and Pompey's sons, fled to North Africa, where they prepared for one last stand against Caesar. Meanwhile, Caesar was drawn into Egypt's internal conflict, as Ptolemy XIII and his sister, Cleopatra, were locked in a struggle for the throne. What followed was the infamous romance between Caesar and Cleopatra, as well as the siege of Alexandria, where Caesar found himself trapped in the royal palace for months. But Caesar was not done consolidating his power. He crushed Pompey's remaining forces in Africa in the Battle of Thapsus 46 BC. He defeated Pompey's sons in Spain at the Battle of Munda 45 BC. He returned to Rome as the unchallenged ruler of the Republic. And in 44 BC, after just 5 years of absolute dominance, he was assassinated in the Senate, stabbed by those who feared he had become a king. 5. The legacy of Pharsalus. The Battle of Pharsalus was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point in world history. It shattered the illusion of Senate supremacy, proving that military might dictate Rome's fate. It ended the career of Pompey the Great, once considered Rome's most powerful general. It propelled Caesar toward dictatorship, setting the stage for the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. Would Rome have survived if Pompey had won? Would the Republic have been restored? Or would another civil war have erupted? These are questions history can never answer. But what is certain is that on August 9, 48 BC, the fate of Rome changed forever, and the consequences would echo for centuries to come. Thus ended the Roman Republic, and thus began the reign of emperors.